The night Clara gave birth should have been the happiest of her life, but instead it became the night everything she had once believed in shattered. The wind howled outside their tiny cabin, rattling the shutters as though nature itself shared in her pain. Clara cradled the newborn girl against her chest, the baby's tiny lungs already strong enough to fill the room with cries that echoed into the rafters. The warmth of her skin and the fragile flutter of her heartbeat should have been a comfort. Yet in the dim glow of the lantern, Clara could already see the storm brewing in her husband's eyes. He stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if he were a stranger looking into someone else's life. Clara's face glistened with sweat, her body trembling with both exhaustion and awe. But he hadn't reached for the child, hadn't whispered a word of reassurance. The silence between them felt heavier than the night air. When she finally asked him to come hold his daughter, he took one step forward, then stopped, shaking his head. His words were sharp and cold, slicing through her fragile joy. "I can't do this, Clara, not with a crying mouth to feed. Not like this." Her heart stilled, disbelief pressing against her ribs. "She's your daughter," Clara whispered, her voice raw from the pain of labor and from pleading. "She's ours." But he looked past her, as though the baby's cries weren't a call to his heart, but a chain around his neck. In that moment Clara saw it his fear, his selfishness, his unwillingness to carry the weight of responsibility. He had always been restless, talking of the open trail, of a life with freedom and no ties. She had hoped, foolishly, that marriage and fatherhood would steady him. Instead, the birth of their daughter only magnified the walls closing in around him. The baby wailed louder, her tiny fists curling, her cheeks red from exertion. The sound pierced through Clara's bones, filling her with a desperate need to soothe. She rocked the child gently, whispering lullabies through her tears, trying to quiet her. But her husband only flinched, turning his face away. "I can't listen to that night after night. I can't live like this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She begged him then, her voice trembling, the weight of fear pressing on her chest. "Don't leave us. Please, she needs you. I need you. We can figure it out." But he was already pulling on his coat, the decision etched into every line of his face. The creak of the floorboards beneath his boots was the sound of finality. He glanced at her once, just once, and in that fleeting look she searched for love, for mercy, for some fragment of the man she thought she knew. But all she found was emptiness. The door opened, and a rush of cold air swept through the cabin. Clara clutched the baby tighter, shielding her tiny face from the chill. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even close the door gently behind him. He walked out into the night, into the howling wind, leaving Clara with nothing but the echoes of his absence. For a long time she couldn't move. Her tears slid silently down her cheeks as she rocked the baby back and forth, whispering over and over, "It's okay, sweetheart, Mama's here. I won't leave you." But even as she spoke the words, fear gnawed at her insides. How could she provide warmth, food, protection, when she had so little left? The fire in the hearth sputtered, the logs nearly gone. She stared at the flames, realizing she had no more wood stacked outside and no husband to fetch it. Her body ached from childbirth, yet already the burden of survival pressed against her shoulders. Still, when she looked down at the baby's tiny face, her heart tightened with fierce determination. This child had no one else now. Whatever it took, however hard the nights ahead, she would fight for her. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Clara pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and let the baby's cries mingle with her own. That was the night her old life ended, and a new one, lonely, fragile, uncertain, began. The days that followed her husband's departure blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and despair. Clara rose each morning to the sound of her baby girl's cries, her body still weak from childbirth, but necessity allowed her no rest. She wrapped the infant in the only thick quilt she had left, pressing the baby close to her chest for warmth as she faced the bitter winds outside the cabin. The woodpile was gone, the pantry shelves nearly bare, and with each passing hour the truth settled deeper into her bones. She was alone. Utterly and completely alone. At first, Clara tried to survive on what little she had. She stretched the flour into thin bread, watered down the last of the milk, and prayed the meager supplies would last. But newborns had needs that couldn't be postponed, and soon she found herself trudging into town, the baby bundled against her heart. The journey was long, the snow heavy, but Clara clung to the hope that she might earn enough to buy food or firewood. The town, however, was not kind. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Women leaned closer to one another when she passed, their voices low but their meaning sharp enough to cut. "That's her. The one he left." Men looked at her with something between pity and disapproval, as though abandonment had stained her reputation. Clara tried to keep her chin high, but the sting of judgment burned with every step she took. She knocked on doors, offered to scrub floors, mend clothes or watch children, anything for a few coins. Some turned her away, too proud to associate with a woman left behind. Others gave her tasks but paid her little, knowing she had no choice but to accept. She worked until her hands blistered and her back ached, all the while keeping the baby close in a sling, rocking her with gentle movements as she scrubbed it and sewed. At night, her daughter's cries still filled the tiny cabin, and Clara wept quietly with her, too tired to sleep, too determined to give up. Hunger soon became her closest companion. Clara often skipped meals, pushing what little she had toward her daughter. Her stomach growled with emptiness, but she forced herself to smile at the baby, whispering lullabies so the child wouldn't sense her fear. Sometimes, when the baby's cries pierced through the silence, Clara broke down, pressing her face into the quilt to muffle her sobs. But each time, after the storm of tears passed, she wiped her eyes, straightened her back, and told herself she had to keep going. The cold grew harsher as the weeks wore on. Clara's fingers cracked and bled from hauling water and chopping what little firewood she could gather. Her boots were thin, letting snow soak her socks until her feet burned with chill. The baby's cheeks flushed red from the cold, and Clara wrapped her tighter, whispering prayers into the child's tiny ears. She could not let her daughter see how close despair clung to her heart. One evening, after a long day in town scrubbing laundry for a family who barely looked her in the eye, Clara overheard two women speaking just outside the mercantile. "That poor girl," one said, shaking her head. "Trying to raise a baby all alone." "She won't last the winter." Clara froze, the words cutting deeper than any blade. They hadn't meant for her to hear, but the truth of their prediction wrapped around her like the cold. She walked away quickly, clutching her baby close, whispering, "We'll prove them wrong, sweetheart. We'll make it. I promise." Yet in the dark of night, when the fire burned low and the wind rattled the cabin, Clara admitted to herself how fragile that promise felt. She was worn down to the bone, her body weak, her spirit fraying at the edges. Each sunrise was both a blessing and a burden proof she had survived another night, and a reminder of how much farther she had to go. Still, Clara refused to give in to despair completely. For every cruel whisper, there was the soft coo of her baby girl, the tiny smile that broke through the tears. That smile reminded Clara that she had something worth fighting for, worth enduring the hunger and the judgment and the bone-deep exhaustion. She would not abandon her daughter, no matter how hard the days became. Winter pressed on, and with it the weight of her struggle. Clara didn't know what awaited her tomorrow, whether it would be another day of hunger, another harsh word in town, or another night with only ashes for warmth. But she knew this. As long as her baby breathed softly against her chest, she would rise again and again until there was no strength left in her body. Clara had grown used to being invisible. In town, she kept her eyes lowered, clutching her baby close as she went about her business. She tried to slip in and out without drawing attention, to avoid the whispers that stung worse than the cold wind. But one pair of eyes always seemed to find her steady, watchful, and strangely unreadable. They belonged to Ethan Hart, the silent rancher who rarely spoke more than a word or two to anyone. Ethan was known in town as a man carved from the land itself, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered from years of labor under the sun. His reputation was one of strength, but also of solitude. Folks said he'd lost family long ago, though no one dared to ask for details. He kept to himself, tending his ranch on the outskirts of town, speaking only when necessary. To most, he was a mystery wrapped in silence. To Clara, he was just another set of eyes she tried to avoid. But Ethan noticed things others ignored. He noticed how Clara's hands trembled when she tried to lift a sack of flour at the mercantile, how she tightened her jaw to keep from crying when the shopkeeper shorted her change. He noticed the way her coat hung too loose on her thin frame, as though she were skipping meals. And he noticed her baby-tiny, frail, with eyes too bright for a child who had already known too much cold. One afternoon, Clara found herself outside the mercantile, her baby wailing in her arms. The child's cries drew impatient stares, and Clara's face burned with embarrassment as she jiggled her gently, murmuring desperate words to soothe her. Her arms ached from carrying the child and the heavy basket of supplies she had managed to buy with her meager earnings. The more she struggled, the more the baby cried, until it seemed the entire street was glaring at her. Then a shadow fell across her. Clara looked up to find Ethan standing there, his broad frame blocking the wind. He said nothing, he rarely did, but after a moment, he reached down and lifted the basket from her arm with ease, as though it weighed nothing at all. Clara stiffened, pride warring with relief. "I can manage," she muttered quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. Ethan didn't argue. He simply shifted the basket to his other hand, steady and calm, and gestured toward the path leading out of town. His silence unnerved her. Most men would have insisted, demanded, or offered pity. But Ethan's quiet presence carried no judgment, no expectation, only a quiet strength that made her feel, for the first time in months, that she wasn't entirely alone. Reluctantly, Clara fell into step beside him. The baby, perhaps sensing the change, began to quiet in her arms. The cries softened to whimpers, then hiccuping sighs, until the child nestled against Clara's chest and drifted to sleep. Clara blinked back sudden tears, overwhelmed by the relief of silence, by the odd peace that seemed to settle over them as they walked side by side. They didn't speak, not until they reached the edge of town where the road forked, one path leading toward Clara's tiny cabin, the other toward Ethan's sprawling ranch. He paused there, setting the basket down gently at her feet. "Too heavy," he said at last, his voice deep and quiet, like the earth itself. Clara blinked, startled by the sound. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than a word in passing. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, clutching the baby tighter. Ethan tipped his hat slightly, then turned toward his own path without another word. Clara watched him go, a strange ache filling her chest. She had expected judgment or perhaps pity. Instead, she had found nothing but silence. And somehow, that silence felt kinder than all the false sympathy she had endured from others. In the days that followed, she saw him again. At the well, where he offered to haul the heavy bucket she could barely lift. Outside the smithy, where he quietly set a split log into her arms when he noticed she had no wood. Always without a word, always without asking for thanks. At first, Clara resisted his help, pride keeping her guard high. But slowly, the edges of her resistance softened. Each time Ethan appeared, steady and dependable as the sunrise, she felt the crushing weight on her shoulders ease, if only for a moment. What she didn't know was that Ethan, too, felt something stir within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Watching Clara struggle awakened memories of loss, of promises left unfulfilled. He had told himself he would live alone. That silence was safer than caring. But every time he saw her clutch that baby to her chest, fighting against a world that had turned cruel, he felt the old walls inside him begin to crack. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, something had shifted between them. The silent rancher had stepped quietly into her world, and Clara, though still cautious, could not deny the faint flicker of hope it brought. The cabin had grown colder by the day, its thin walls no match for the sharp bite of winter. Clara tried to keep the fire alive with scraps of wood she gathered from the forest's edge, but the flames never lasted long. Her baby coughed at night, a small, rasping sound that made Clara's heart twist with fear. Each time she pressed her lips to the child's forehead, praying the warmth she felt wasn't fever. But she knew the truth. Her daughter was growing weaker. One bitter evening, Clara returned from town with only a half sack of meal and a few strips of dried meat. Her baby whimpered restlessly against her chest, and Clara's own body felt drained, her steps heavy as lead. When she reached the cabin, she found Ethan Hart waiting just outside. The sight startled her. He stood there with his horse tethered nearby, a small bundle in his arms. "You shouldn't be out here," Clara said quickly, her voice a mix of suspicion and weariness. She hugged the baby closer, as though to shield her from whatever this silent man might bring. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he held out the bundle neatly split firewood, stacked and tied. His steady gaze flicked to the child, who let out another weak cough, then back to Clara. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "Too cold in there." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to insist she could manage, but the truth pressed heavy on her chest. She couldn't. Not anymore. She nodded stiffly, taking the wood from him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Ethan tipped his hat and turned to leave, but before he mounted his horse, he paused. "Come to the ranch," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying no hint of demand, only an offering. The words stunned Clara. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, filled only by the baby's labored breaths and the rustle of the wind. "I can't," she whispered. Pride, fear, and shame tangled together inside her. "It isn't proper. People will talk." Ethan met her gaze unflinching. "Let them." Clara stood frozen as he rode off into the night. His words echoed in her mind long after he was gone. Let them. Simple, but powerful. That night, as the fire sputtered and her baby's cough worsened, Clara lay awake, torn between fear of gossip and the desperate need to keep her child safe. The next morning, she made her decision. Wrapping her daughter in the quilt, she gathered what little she owned, a threadbare dress or two, a basket of mended linens, a few cooking utensils, and loaded them into a worn sack. Every step toward Ethan's ranch felt like a step into the unknown, but the weight of her baby in her arms reminded her what was at stake. When she reached the ranch, Ethan was in the yard, chopping wood. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, though he quickly masked it. Clara stood trembling, her heart pounding, her belongings clutched in her free hand. "If your offer still stands," she said softly, "we'll accept." Ethan didn't smile, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that steadied her. He nodded once, then reached for her sack, carrying it inside without another word. The ranch house was warm, the air thick with the scent of stew simmering on the hearth. Clara felt her knees weaken with relief as she stepped inside. For the first time in months, she felt heat that seeped into her bones. The baby stirred, then relaxed against her, the coughing easing in the warmth. Clara's throat tightened as she whispered, "Thank you." Life on the ranch took on a rhythm Clara hadn't known since before her husband left. Ethan rose early, tending to the livestock and fields, while Clara helped with the household chores. She cooked meals, mended clothes, and washed dishes, grateful to contribute. Yet Ethan never demanded her labor, he simply provided space for her and the child to breathe, to heal. What surprised Clara most was Ethan's quiet patience. He didn't press her with questions about her past, didn't pry into the wound of her abandonment. He gave her room to speak if she wished, and when silence fell between them, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, grounding, like the earth beneath her feet. The baby seemed to sense it too. In Ethan's presence she cried less, slept more soundly. One evening, as Clara rocked her near the fire, Ethan stepped into the room. The child's eyes fluttered open, and instead of wailing, she reached toward him with tiny fingers. Ethan froze, startled, then slowly extended a hand. When the baby grasped his finger, Clara saw something soften in his expression, a crack in the wall of silence he kept around himself. That night, as Clara lay in the small room Ethan had offered her, she thought of the warmth of the house, the strength of his hands, and the calm he brought simply by being near. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future not ruled by fear or loneliness. She wasn't ready to trust completely, not yet. But hope had begun to take root, and it had begun in the shelter of a silent rancher's home. The days on Ethan's ranch settled into a rhythm that Clara hadn't known in what felt like a lifetime. Morning light streamed through the windows, soft and golden, chasing away the icy grip of winter. Clara rose early with her baby, cooking simple meals in the warm kitchen, while Ethan tended to the livestock outside. It was an unspoken arrangement. He provided the safety of his home, and she cared for it in return. No words were needed, yet somehow it felt like a partnership. Fragile but steady. Clara often found herself watching Ethan from the porch as he worked. His movements were strong, deliberate, never wasted. He spoke little, even to the men who occasionally came by to trade cattle or supplies, but there was a quiet authority about him. What struck Clara most was not his strength, but his gentleness. Once she saw him kneel to set a small injured calf back on its feet, his large hand resting softly against its flank until it steadied. That same gentleness showed whenever he glanced toward the baby. Her daughter, whom Clara named Rose, seemed to sense something in Ethan that eased her tiny spirit. In Clara's arms, Rose often fussed and cried, the colicky wails piercing through the rooms. But in Ethan's arms, something remarkable happened. Her cries softened, then stopped, as if she trusted him instinctively. Clara could scarcely believe it the first time she witnessed it. Ethan had taken the baby, awkward at first, holding her stiffly against his chest. Rose's cries faltered, then melted into quiet coos, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. Clara blinked back tears she hadn't expected. She's never quieted like that for anyone but me, she whispered. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then looked back down at Rose. Strong lungs, he said simply. Yet there was something in his tone, something softer than usual, that made Clara's heart ache. The walls Clara had built around herself, walls made of pride, fear, and memories of betrayal, began to crack. One evening, after the chores were finished and Rose had finally drifted to sleep, Clara sat by the fire with Ethan across from her. The flames danced between them, shadows flickering against the walls. For a long time, neither spoke. Clara stared into the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and before she could stop herself, words tumbled free. I was so afraid she wouldn't survive, she admitted, her voice low. There were nights I thought I'd lose her to the cold or to hunger, and I wondered if she would hate me one day for not giving her a better start. Her voice broke and tears welled in her eyes. She turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness. But Ethan didn't speak right away. He simply leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady and calm. You kept her alive, he said finally. His words were few, but each one carried weight. "That's more than most could have done." Clara's tears fell silently, not from grief this time, but from the strange comfort of being understood. She had braced herself for pity or judgment, but Ethan offered neither. His words were like the earth beneath her feet, solid, unshakable. From that night on, something shifted. Clara began to see Ethan not just as the silent rancher who had taken them in, but as a man who, without fanfare or promises, had chosen to stand by them. His silence was no longer a barrier but a kind of promise in itself that he would not leave, that he would not wound her with careless words or empty vows. The promise grew stronger in the small ways he showed care. He fixed the loose shutter in her room so the cold wouldn't seep through at night. He left extra logs by the hearth without being asked. When Clara's hands blistered from scrubbing laundry, he quietly set a tin of salve on the table. No speeches, no grand gestures, only steady, unyielding presence. Clara found herself leaning on that presence more each day. For the first time since her husband had abandoned her, she allowed herself to breathe without fear pressing on her chest. She caught herself smiling more often, even laughing when Rose's little giggles filled the house. And though she still guarded her heart, a quiet hope began to bloom inside her, a hope that perhaps life could be gentler than she had known. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Ethan stood on the porch with Rose cradled in his arms. The baby's tiny hand grasped his finger, her eyes wide and trusting. Clara watched from the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. The sight of them together, her child safe in the arms of a man who had no obligation to care for them, felt like a promise in itself, one stronger than words. She realized then that Ethan had given her something she hadn't known she was starving for. Not just shelter, not just food or safety, but the steady reassurance that she and her daughter were no longer alone. It wasn't spoken aloud, but Clara felt it as surely as if he'd sworn it. In his silence, Ethan had made a promise. The dawn came quietly over the wide Texas plains, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. For the first time in years, Emily felt the weight of despair lifting from her shoulders. The farmhouse, once only a shelter of uncertainty, now felt like a true home. Her daughter's soft breathing from the cradle in the corner was like a melody of hope, and she couldn't help but smile as she brushed a strand of hair from her tired face. The man who had once been only a silent rancher had become so much more than a benefactor. He had become a guardian, a partner, and now a husband in name and promise. The ranch itself seemed transformed, as though it reflected their new chapter. The fences were sturdy, the cattle well-fed, and the barns alive with the hum of purpose. Emily found herself thriving in the rhythm of ranch life, kneading dough in the mornings, tending to the chickens, and joining Luke in feeding the livestock. Each day wove her deeper into the land and into the life they were building together. But most of all, it wove her deeper into Luke's heart. Though he still didn't speak much, Emily had come to understand the language of his silences, the steady hand on her shoulder, the warm glance across the table, the way he cradled her baby girl as though she were his own blood. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden glow over the fields, Luke came in from the pasture, dust clinging to his boots. Emily was rocking the baby on the porch, humming softly. Luke paused at the sight, her face illuminated by the fading light, her eyes soft with a peace he hadn't seen before. He sat beside her, quiet for a long moment, before speaking words she hadn't expected. "You belong here. Both of you." His voice, though gruff, carried a tenderness that made her heart ache. Emily's throat tightened. For months she had wondered if she was simply a burden he had taken in out of pity. But now, hearing those words, she realized the truth. He wanted them there, not just out of duty, but out of choice. She placed her hand over his, and in that simple gesture, something unspoken passed between them, a vow stronger than any ceremony in town. Whispers had turned from ridicule to respect. Folks who once pitied Emily now nodded kindly when she passed, seeing the quiet strength she carried and the solid man who walked at her side. Her former shame had transformed into a kind of pride, not arrogance, but the pride of a woman who had survived the storm and found a safe harbor. There were challenges, of course. Babies cried in the night, storms rolled across the plains, and money was sometimes tight. But Luke never wavered. Whenever the baby's cries pierced the darkness, he rose from bed without complaint, pacing the floor with the child in his arms until she settled. Emily often watched him in those moments, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. He wasn't the man who had fathered her child, but he was the man who had chosen to be her father. As the seasons turned, the ranch prospered. Emily's hands became calloused from work, but she wore them with pride, a symbol of the life she was building. Her daughter grew strong and lively, her first words echoing through the house like a blessing. And Luke, though still a man of few words, began to smile more, laugh occasionally, and let the walls around his heart crumble piece by piece. One spring afternoon, Emily stood in the field, watching Luke teach the little girl to walk on the soft grass. The child stumbled, giggled, and reached for him, and Luke scooped her up with a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. Emily's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of joy. She realized then that they were no longer bound by the past. They had built something new, something rooted not in abandonment or pity, but in choice, trust, and love. As the sun warmed her face, Emily whispered a silent prayer of thanks. Her journey had been marked by loss, betrayal, and fear, but it had led her here to a place where her daughter was cherished, where she was valued, and where a quiet rancher had given them not just his name, but his heart. And so in the heart of the wide, untamed West, Emily found the life she thought she had lost forever. Not a fairy tale, but something stronger, something real. A family.